Hi, I'm Michael Govan, director of the museum. Thank you, and we're very happy that you're here. This has been a big week, our 50th anniversary of the 50th anniversary of LACMA, our 50th birthday party. So we've been having a good time, and as you probably know, the galleries are open for many events. We're going to have free public days. It's been a great celebration. But tonight, I'm especially pleased to have one of my great heroes, mentors in the museum world, here to talk with us. Neil MacGregor, who is director of the British Museum. Often in these conversations, I have had them with artists because I'm a friend of many artists, and I really believe that artists are at the center of what we do. But it's also very enjoyable to see the creative talent within our field. And so, as you know, a few creative people like Neil MacGregor have been here as museum directors, and others, architects most recently too. So I'm very happy that we can have a conversation with him about the ways in which our museums are changing. And I think that's one of the things we've been talking about, that museums aren't fixed, they're changing. We'll talk about that. His resume is too long to read in its entirety because it would take the full hour. But he studied languages at Oxford, philosophy as well in Paris, law in Edinburgh, and then art history at the Courtauld Institute. And you may know that before his appointment at the British Museum in 2002, he was director of the National Gallery, London, from 1987 to 2002, and he was also editor of the Burlington magazine. I'm often one to tout our attendance increases of late because we've doubled our attendance in recent years from 600,000 to 1.2 million. Well, what I want to say, under Neil's tenure, attendance at the British Museum has increased from 4.6 to 6.7 million. So we're nothing. That we can applaud. And you may know something about the collection, if you haven't been there. Many of you I know have been here, but there was a BBC radio series around 100 objects, which was turned into a beautiful book, which Neil coordinated, wrote the introduction to. We'll talk about it later, called A History of the World in 100 Objects. He recently completed a new building project, which we'll talk about at the British Museum, and you may know something of the internationally acclaimed series of exhibitions that have been held there recently, including Ice Age art, Life and Death in Pompeii and Herculaneum, Vikings, Life and Legend, and currently Indigenous Australia. And under Neil's leadership, the British Museum has built partnerships not only across the UK, but he's been at the forefront of opening the collections to the world, and we'll talk about that as well. Sadly, for us, for the British Museum, Neil recently announced his retirement, that he'll be retiring at the end of this year. The Guardian in London characterized him as one of the most respected museum leaders in the world. I agree, and I'm sure you will all agree. And please welcome Neil MacGregor. Today, we're going to talk about, for a change, with me, museums and art. So I am very excited to have you here, Neil, to talk about how you've changed the British Museum recently, but I'm hoping we can have a conversation about how museums are changing as we go along. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the building program that you just not long ago finished, as we also engage in that. Of course, the art's the issue, the building is the frame, and we can talk about that. But for those of you who've heard me before in describing urban light as our temple facade, every great museum has a temple facade, and ours is by an LA artist of LA street lamps. But in case you don't know, this is the reference to the real deal. The British Museum, which was built very much as a temple. So I wonder, Neil, if maybe just to start, you could say a little something about the Temple Museum and the British Museum, and in particular your building project. And if you'd like, I'll switch the slides, or you can.
Thank you. I should start by explaining the bow. I chose this slide because this was our last birthday celebration. In 2003, the museum was 250. And
Not 50, did you get that? That's 50 plus 200.
and we didn't really know quite how to mark this, so eventually decided the simplest thing was just to remind everyone that this was a great present to the nation and to everybody else, and wrapped a bow around it. But what it does show is, because one of the real problems about a building that has become iconic and canonical and difficult to change, because the British Museum, this bit of the museum was built in the 1820s and was the first museum to be built as a Greek temple. Now, this, of course, is absolutely fine, the columns that Michael was talking about, but, of course, all Greek temples have only one door in the middle, because only one priest went into them. Now, this is difficult if you've got 6.7 million priests trying to get in every year. And it has become the real problem for us. I mean, how do you make an 1830s Greek temple work for a mass modern public? And it's been the problem all the way through the building, and it's one that goes on and on. I know it's the same problem here. But I think that idea of a building that has to keep changing because the building is only a means to an end is one of the really interesting challenges for all of us.
Have you considered tearing down the temple?
No. But if you knew the struggles we'd had with the planning committee, I don't know how it works here, but we have very difficult planning authorities. And the local borough is in charge. And the idea even of having some more doors is at the moment being treated as though we were trying to pull it all down. But we hope that one day when you come, there'll be more doors. What we were able to do was put up a new building tucked away at the back to give us the space we need for the things that have accrued since 1830. The need for a temporary exhibition space, which is on the ground floor effectively here, the need for conservation studios. Very few of our conservators were ever allowed above ground until quite recently. This shows they're now in the light at the top, which is scientists and conservators at the top, and at the bottom, the wonderful thing is because the museum has been on the site for so long, there's nothing like undergrounds or tubes or electricity or gas underneath. So we were able to go down 4 floors, and this gives us now proper study collection space where we can store the research collection and teach from it at the same time. And it allows us, for instance, to have proper studios for particularly here, stone studios. I want you just to look at that Egyptian statue. It will come back later on. And for the first time, I say now we have natural light for them. So we have momentarily very happy conservators. They're a temperamental breed, as you know, but at the moment they're smiling.
How long did this project take from initial idea through completion?
It was only about 8 years.
Right.
But the real problem was planning, because it's all in Bloomsbury and the whole area is listed, and they're very concerned about what you build onto the historic British Museum. And we had terrific problems because the local planning authority split pretty well evenly. And then we discovered that actually the swing vote on the local planning committee was a Green councillor. And everything hinged then on how ecological we could be. So we had to redesign the roof. And when you go to the roof of the British Museum now, you find beekeepers constantly at work. This is totally ridiculous. Absolutely preposterous. It means that our visitors are likely to be stung in very large numbers. The conservators, of course, then immediately got very alarmed about what other insects might accompany the bees and whether they might then settle in the textile collection or whatever, as you can imagine. So we now have a kind of bee which apparently is very specific and will keep out hostile insects. But we also have green boxes so that certain kinds of swifts and swallows can swirl around you. And this won the planning authority's approval. So we hope in due course that when distinguished directors come to visit, we'll be able to give them a small pot of BM honey. But I'm sure you've similar games and struggles. But it's part of the constant
Hadn't even
struggle.
thought of that.
This, by the way, is one of our curators. This is our this is our Stone Age girl, who is an absolute whiz on the Paleolithic, and in her spare time does the bees, which apparently were also known in the Stone Age. So it cross works with her research. So it's, but it's always the question: how do you make the building renew, and how do you change it to serve its purpose? And with storage, that's our big problem. This is the kind of building we've inherited. And this is because the museum and the library were together. And this is now, all this is listed, so we can't change it. This is now where we store our cuneiform clay tablets. We have a colossal collection of them. And it's this kind of storage for different kinds of materials, different kinds of objects. All these things, as you know, they're dried, baked clay, about 3,500 years old. They look exactly like dog biscuits with scratches on the top. And scholars from all over the world congregate and piece them together and decipher them. And they need particular climatic conditions and so on. And making the new storage was one of the great things, of course, of the new building. How that we can, because we need to have some objects there that scholars can come to study.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so just before leaving this historic slide, if you could say, I wonder if you could say 2 words about the origins of this great museum, because here we are looking at a library. You're placing these tablets, which are the most ancient forms of sort of written books or whatever would be written records. And in a way, the impulse for that museum comes out of a kind of idea of storage, right? That the original, I wonder if you could say something about that original, because we, of course, being only 50 years old, don't have that history. But this, where do we come from, these museums of world cultures, libraries?
The British Museum is the first of the national museums anywhere. It's also the first trustee museum. And it comes out of the moment in London in the 1720s, 1730s, when for the first time there was really a global economy. London in the 1720s is probably the first place in the history of the world where you could sail to anywhere in the world and come back and collect the whole world. And Parliament gets very interested in how you can allow the public to understand the world. And so the aim of the British Museum is to be the place where in one building you can have the whole world and see it together, think of it together as one. And that was to be everything. It was to be animals, plants, books, and artifacts. And that idea of a huge library of the world where you could come and study, anybody could come and study, is where it began. The Parliament decides that this great intellectual endeavour must not be under the control of the Crown, under the control of government. If you want a free citizen, it mustn't be managed by the state. And so they invent a trustee body. And it's the first trustee museum with the public worldwide as the beneficiaries. And that's why all these things are here, gathered slowly over 250 years to let you think about the whole world together. It's exactly the same as here, of course. I mean,
Much
the idea
later.
of the whole world
The whole
in
world.
one place.
Right, and I want to talk about that later, about the whole world and the living whole world. But while we're on this subject of storage, because there's the famous, today the values are about the public exhibition. Museums are totally professionalized. We have these big exhibitions, and there's the sense that you can walk in and see things. And there are collectors who will remain unnamed, who will say to me, well, I'm not giving you a work of art because you're just going to put it in storage. But actually the history of our museums come from the idea of storing, keeping, having available, being a library. And I'm really interested because I think now we're recognizing that we can blend storage and use, that storage does not mean a dark room, because when the collector says that, they mean going into a dark room where no one will see it. And the answer, I think, museums thinking now has been a little bit like returning to the 19th or 18th centuries even, where the idea is the storage was open and available, which is some of what you've done here, right?
Exactly. I mean, in the 18th century in particular, of course, the key thing is to gather lots and lots of examples of the same type of object so that you can establish a chronology, a typology, and really work out the histories of whatever it is. Now, nobody in their senses would want to look at all these Buddhas together. Other than the scholar specialist. But it's having them all that, of course, allows you to select some and know what the some you selected are. And the idea of these as open storage, which scholars can come to, anyone can come to, from which we can lend whatever. This is, I think, really central to the way our museum, at least, is going. And I think, as Michael says, many others.
Yeah, I think because, and in a strange way, it goes back to the earliest ideas that the storage is open in some ways to scholars. It has use because we need objects for comparison. We need objects to lend. And there is this back and forth dialogue between what is storage and what is sort of that finished exhibition space, without which the museum doesn't function well.
Exactly.
And I know you've done many things. We've been talking at LACMA about the idea that, can we make storage open like this and more accessible to the public? Many museums have done this. And if we do need additional storage, we've been talking about doing storage off-site or maybe not so close to the museum so that objects might be available to other communities. And it was interesting. You said to me the other day today that you were thinking similarly.
Exactly. This is one of our more dramatic stores, as you can see. Textile storage is, of course, by definition, not very thrilling. But this is very...
Looks very minimalist, very interesting
exactly,
to me.
But I'm told this is very good textile storage. What we're aiming to do with this is actually move our textile store off-site and put it into East London. East London was always the centre of the textile industry. It was always where the immigrants arrived in London. And the idea, we're going to put our textile collection and the Victoria and Albert's textile collection together to make a world textile storage centre and study centre with rotating displays. And I think there will be nowhere else in the world where you can look at the whole world's weaving, the whole world's textile together. And using these as the basis from which you take textiles up for a few weeks and then put them down again, will, I think, be a great step forward. Moving out of the museum to the site of where the Olympics were is the plan. There's this enormous space and buildings looking for a function. And we think they probably found it.
Yeah, well, and also London is such a spread out city also.
Yeah, exactly.
To reach those other neighborhoods with something
Well, it's kind
cultural.
of you in Los Angeles to talk of London as a spread-out city. And we feel very, very village-like when we come here.
So speaking of comparisons, to show this beautiful, minimal, accessible storage, not to be outdone, I can show you our storage, which is mostly covered in plastic because we have leaks through 4 floors, and you see it crammed into corners and very inaccessible, which is the sad part. Which is partly why we're rethinking about this, or yes, these beautiful storage spaces that we have that are exactly not accessible. Anyway, we'll go on to the next topic. In 10 years, we'll be able to show you something we're proud of. I definitely want to ask you about the building project in many ways. Because a lot of what you did was rethink space for art and circulation, but a lot of what you did, you have to accommodate 6.7 million people, and I guess that was one of the biggest challenges, was not to house the art, was to house the people, yes. Right?
I was very lucky that when I arrived, this project had just been finished. It was done for the year 2000, and the British Museum was built as a quadrangle, as you can see, And in the middle of it was the circular reading room, which was for most of from the 1850s until the 1990s, the great reading room where everybody, Darwin, Marx, Dickens, all wrote. The reading room was in the middle, and the court was open. And slowly, as you know, what happens with books is they multiply. And slowly the courtyard got filled up completely with little sheds to take another couple of thousand books until it was totally inaccessible. When the library moved out, the trustees decided that they would clad the reading room and then invite Norman Foster to cover the courtyard and make this the center from which people can set out to explore the world. And on a busy day, we'll have somewhere between 20 and 25,000 people. And a lot of them come in groups. And this space has been really wonderful. It's allowed people to navigate their way around the museum, to gather, and they know where to come back to. So this has really been an essential bit of our thinking of the way the public can use the collection.
And this is over a decade old, but I would assume, like most places, that you have things keep changing in terms of your public. The growth, even since then, has been 2 million people.
The thing that we're still trying to change is, as you know, all really good architects dislike the idea of signage. It's one of the ways you recognize you've got a world-class architect on your hands. And Norman Foster is a world-class architect. So there is no wall on which it's possible to put any kind of sign. So you need these stelae, which of course are not really big enough and are in the wrong place. And we do need seriously to think how you direct people in a museum like this more effectively, more efficiently. I mean, a huge problem. We hope it's going to be solved with Wi-Fi, which we've now just put in across the building, and that more and more of our visitors will come with their own devices and be able to navigate on that. But that's really one of our huge things. And the other thing is, of course, the very serious under-provision of lavatories. I don't know whether there's a problem here. Our trustees 20 years ago took the rather brisk view that people should go before they left home. But with an aging population, this is no longer enough. And it's a very serious problem. You're a young city. So
You did mention why. Well, now we're going to be looking out for that. You mentioned Wi-Fi. How has the digital revolution changed your thinking, given so many people, given the changing world with media, books online, pictures online? I mean, I know we don't have a slide to illustrate that, but I'm curious about, from your perspective, with this many visitors, what your outlook on this new world has been.
The big thing for us it's changed is the notion of labeling, but above all of languages. I presume you have the same question here. The real problem is because if English is your first language, there is no second language. You have to go immediately to 10. So the wonderful thing about digital, we've got a partnership with Samsung, and they've allowed us to provide a whole series of guides in the next 15 languages for our visitors. And that's the biggest change. But we're also now developing for every gallery a Wi-Fi, a digital guide. This is just more of the same. But these are the multimedia, multi-language guides, which have made a huge difference in terms of taking the strain off labeling and off the crowds going around in groups.
Now, you have a bigger sample audience than we do, but have you found that is effective and that people like these multimedia, multi-language guides?
The British loathe them because it suggests they don't already know. They would much rather wander around with no idea what they're looking at. So there's a very serious problem of amour propre. The more enlightened, particularly continental visitors, are very relaxed. And of course, visitors from the Far East expect them and use them the whole time. But we have a huge cultural barrier. That has been broken down with the mobile phone.
Right.
So we're very hopeful that the iPhone will allow even the British audience to get information about the collection.
It's interesting because I often say that, we started to fill our museums with more text than pictures, and there's that famous work, I forget the artist who did it, which is a giant wall label with a small picture next to it, because every survey shows that people spend more time looking at the labels than the pictures. On the other hand, and by the way, they're only in one language, or at best two, and they're very limited, where these new devices do create a sort of, you choose how much information you want in what language. And I know there's a lot of skepticism about the electronic device, but I guess other than the British, you've found it useful.
Yes, the problem is probably very different here, but there are very few public spaces in London which have free Wi-Fi. So we have found that the galleries where we first put it in were immediately colonized by the young running their businesses from the floor. It was absolutely
Office space.
Office space, exactly. It's really impossible to get near the Assyrian reliefs because of people doing their businesses. But that's changing, I'm glad to say.
We do offer free Wi-Fi, and we've sort of used our plaza that way. We actually like the idea that people are there 24/7. Some of my New York friends sort of were a little bit shocked when I put the restaurant and the bar right at the entrance. Right. But I think that we have grown into the sense that the museum, especially the World Culture Museum, is a little bit of a town square. I mean, we certainly offer concerts and other things. I don't know if I've ever seen concerts in your spaces, but there is this sense, right, that the plaza, the space, is a space for everyone. It's a free Wi-Fi should be offered. It's an attitude we have now pretty commonly, I think, in our museum field.
It's right. I'm very envious of the fact that you have this capacity to engage with the street like this. I mean, not just the weather, but the architecture. Again, that ridiculous single door makes it very hard for the Great Court to be the town plaza, which it could have been otherwise. But I love the way already LACMA spills in and out of the civics urban space. And it's a huge advantage, I think.
Yeah, and that was a little bit the idea of putting things on the street and having the equivalent of the central courtyard open. I guess this is just another. Is this your slide? Or is this ours? This could be ours. This is ours. Another event.
Look at the weather.
We have so many events.
At the weather.
We have so many events. I can't even keep track of them all. 360 events, and here's the restaurant at the bar at the entrance, which I think is kind of fun. Speaking of crowds. Somebody in New York
What is going on?
This is the opening of Levitated Mass, and a New York art critic I was reading in the paper the other day described this as a cheap Instagram moment. But we're actually very proud of our Instagram pictures and the fact that there is this weighty, classical-looking sculpture here. I wanted to ask you, because I know you've been very forward about engaging not just the people who naturally come because you're a tourist attraction, but your efforts, even with 6.7 million people, you do a lot of work to reach out to diverse communities. And I think that is something that has completely changed in museums in the last 15 to 20 years, is that there was a time when you sat there as the museum, you build it, and they will come, and you wait for the visitor, and at best you open your doors, there's a friendly entrance if possible. But now it is considered absolutely necessary that the museum be in communities and thinking that way no matter how many visitors we have. And I know you've even been doing that with so many.
I think that's right. It's been a huge change everywhere. I think for the British Museum it was a very extreme change because the museum was created essentially really as a series of libraries. I mean, not just the book library, but all the others. And there's still the fact that anybody can turn up and ask to see any one of the 9 million objects, and it'll be brought to them, exactly like a library. And the idea was very much just as no librarian would actually go out trying to suggest what books the people coming into the library might want to read, that there was something rather odd about promoting your collection. But the other thing that's changed, of course, is the population of London. In the last 50 years, the demographic of London has been completely transformed, so that central London now less than 30% of the population of Central London were born in the UK. And there's a great competitive debate about how many native languages, mother tongues, are spoken in London. But we're certainly between 200 and 300, so very like Los Angeles. And the question really has become, I think, that the realization that after 200 years of the objects coming from all over the world to London, the people have now followed the objects. And that there is now in London a population which, although a British population now, will find its own individual history in the context of the British Museum. And one of our big challenges has been, how do you get a community that has no habit of museum going to use the collection as its own? And I thought it'd just be worth showing what we did with the Bengali population. There's obviously a huge Indian population in London. This is, for Bengalis, the great festival of the year is the festival of Durga Puja, when the goddess Durga is celebrated. It comes in the autumn. It's the great thing in Calcutta. And we brought from West Bengal craftsmen to make, out of clay and various other things, the image of the goddess. And then the next one, you see it completed behind. And it was made in the Great Court over about 5 or 6 weeks. And it's where, for us, the advantage of free admission becomes enormous, because tens of thousands of Bengalis brought their children and their grandchildren to watch this being made, to show the British-born Bengalis this particular tradition. And you can see from the audience how strongly the local population engaged. What was fascinating about it was that, although this, of course, is a Hindu festival, it is for Bengalis as cross-cultural as Christmas is to us. And many Muslim Bengalis also came, brought their children, and we had a whole series of events around that. It was for many the first time, of course, they'd come, and it allowed us then to go on working with the Bengali communities, running classes and lectures in Bengali, not just about the Bengali collection, but about the ancient Greek collection, Stonehenge, whatever. And I think that idea of the museum as the civic space where the different strands of our new cities find what they are and share it with each other is one of our great roles. This is the object when it's finished. The usual thing, it is the good goddess overcoming evil. And then at the end of the celebrations, the whole thing has to be surrendered to the Ganges. Well, obviously that's quite tricky in London. But like all great religions, Hinduism can transform and transubstantiate reality. And as it happens, any river can, for the purposes, become the Ganges. So this is the Ganges somewhere near Putney Bridge. And it was a wonderful moment, just as the goddess returned to the waters, this wonderful rainbow appeared in the sky, which everyone took to be a great symbol of intercultural harmony. This festival became for us a very interesting way of trying to demonstrate to a wide public, it became very, very popular, how the long-standing traditions adapt to the modern events. And to make the very key point, I think, that really only museums and collections like encyclopedic ones like LACMA, like the British Museum, can do, that every tradition will see the modern event in their own terms, and that will not be the same thing. One of the great traditions of the Bengali communities is storytelling, public storytelling from scrolls. And we ran a program of that, of course. But the scrolls they chose were very fascinating. We have the next one. This is the scroll of 9/11. And this was it was extraordinarily shocking, in the good sense of that word, experience to see how that event could be understood, talked about, told, and presented in a totally different culture, staying within its tradition while absorbing the new. And I got more and more interested in these moments that we know about, seen in a way that we could never have got to without the objects. How objects do allow us to think the world in a different way. Not just this event, but another very popular scroll was the life of Mrs. Gandhi. And here, in this wonderful mythic image, is indeed the birth of Mrs. Gandhi, rising like a goddess from the shape of India. Here, her birth at the top, and then you see in the middle, she's reading to Mahatma Gandhi when he's fasting. And then this rather striking image of Oxford University at the bottom, which, again, not the way I think any British person would have been able to imagine Oxford University. And then going on, the extraordinary moment of her assassination by her Sikh bodyguards at the back, and then her being carried into heaven. I found this one of the really valuable justifications of a collection like these ones. Why it is that we must have things made in other cultures to be looked at by all of us. It meant something very particular hearing it from them, of course, hearing them tell it, but it also allowed, I think, a totally British audience to understand in a completely different way what Mrs. Gandhi represented, how she could be imagined, and to remember that within our fellow citizens, there are these very, very other ways of thinking about the world.
It's interesting. We were talking earlier about the fact that one of the other really seismic shifts in point of view about museums and how we present them is this idea that you would go into a museum to bear witness to the miracle of something of the past, almost like that. And more, we seem to be shifting to the question of living cultures and how do these objects, this kind of somehow a flattening of time, and more emphasis on questions of identity and less of history. And we were talking about this changes in cities.
Yep. And I think what I find interesting about that is that this is really a return to the 18th century. Right. This is a return to the Enlightenment. I mean, when the British Museum is set up, it is already charged by Parliament to collect the modern world. Mm-hmm. And the point of having the past for the 18th century is to understand the present. Right. And then at some point in the mid-19th century, and it went on for over 100 years, the past became its own purpose. And we lost, I think, that idea that the value of this is not just the curiosity of then, but what this tells us about now, either about what people always do the same or what's different, or why people now think about themselves differently. I mean, how an Indian sees the world is now critical for us to understand. And as you say, it's particularly in the cities we live in. Right. And what I find interesting is, I mean, for us, of course, this population is one of the key ones. I imagine here it would be perhaps a Korean or Japanese local population whose traditions you would want to explore in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think many populations, like London, there are many populations here, maybe with obviously an emphasis on Latin America and on Asia. Of course, there is the question of also cultures who aren't used to visiting museums, which with all the aplomb that museums were invented in the Enlightenment is a European idea and doesn't necessarily translate in the same way to other cultures. So I think we continually are trying to reach out for that reason, not because we want more visitors, but we seem to really want the diversity of point of view and the question of identity. One of the things I think about is that, and we were talking about this earlier, at one point there was also this idea of New York was the melting pot. We give up all of our cultural identities, change our names, be one city. Now it seems that the value is maintaining, almost like a museum, maintaining identities, maintaining aspects of global cultures, maintaining them for the sake of diversity and conversation. And I think at one point it was considered that a city couldn't function if you had people of different points of view, so they should all pledge allegiance like Roman citizens to the one. And now I think there's a shifting belief that there is a strong value in that diversity, a value that's very much upheld by the museum, right? That's the point of the museum in some way.
I think that's right. There's certainly in European terms, there's now a very, very strong divide between the British and the French approach to this question, whether an immigrant population should integrate but remain what it is, or assimilate and become like the host population. The French model is, of course, a very extreme one, that there's only one way of being a French citizen, which is to be totally French. And that you can't be French and something else. The British model has always been very different, partly because Britain itself has been a muddle of different bits, partly because it was too difficult to think out how you could just be one. But I think the current American position and the British position are now very alike, of almost fostering the difference in the context of a wider citizenship, and that there are many different ways of being citizens, being both American and something, or British and something.
Yeah,
and the museum is central to this, I'm sure.
It seems central. I mean, again, when I was going to school, there wasn't that sense that these big museums were interested in that, or interested in contemporary culture. They had lost that sense. Similarly, when LACMA was founded, I mean, even when it was part of the Los Angeles Museum, you see among the collecting lists, they were all about collecting things of the present as well. And you're right, somewhere along the line it lost it. I mean, the reason MoCA was founded here, or contemporary art museums around the country, is that museums like this, or yours, weren't doing their jobs, weren't interested as much in the now, and so these other museums emerged. But it seems to me, as the now is more diverse, that you really need a big museum, a diverse museum, encyclopedic, I don't love the word, but you need a museum like that to sort of match the ambition diversity of the metropolis.
I think that's right. And again, it's these cities that we now live in, whether it's Los Angeles or London, I think New York's probably the only other one in the world like it. There have never been cities like this before. I mean, there have never in history been cities with this number of different traditions coexisting. And the real challenge, I think, of a global coexistence has got to be played out first in our cities. And getting that sorted, I mean, might then help with the wider questions.
I want to focus mostly on your projects, but I wanted to say, for some people who don't know everything LACMA is doing outside of the museum, we've been very much focused on new audiences too, and different models. This happens to be Charles White Elementary School at MacArthur Park, which may seem just a short drive down Wilshire Boulevard, but for those families who live in that neighborhood, LACMA can be a long way away. So we've been developing exhibitions in Charles White Elementary School with objects from the collection, and creating opportunities really to push the museum outside. You were talking about that too, that at some point, like the textile storage, we need to be also pushing the museum outside the boundaries of the single space. There are barriers of transportation, and certainly in certain economic strata, it's harder to get to. We've used that space. We've also developed mobile museums. We have our trucks, the Maya Mobile and the World Art Mobile, that move around, but recently we created an artist, Jorge Pardo, created a space where we did movies in parks around Los Angeles and Riverside County, and we would have a mobile situation where people actually learned to make films and recorded themselves. And we had an artist, this was a media-focused traveling museum box where there was education taking place, an artist working there, an artist who made the space. And
can I ask about the Maya mobiles, because do you have actually artifacts in them?
So this is a big question, and you and I are aligned on this. When our Maya mobile has almost no real objects. And I know from your history and a story that someone just told here, you're famous for wanting to have art people can touch.
Yes.
And I have been a huge proponent of trying to put more and more real objects, and we have 5, 6,000, 7,000 objects of ancient American art. Some are better than others. It would be amazing to have children holding 1,000-year-old ceramics in their hands. And this is a little bit this question. We've become so professional, so caring of our past that, I love conservators, but there's also this question about whether you can touch it anymore. And I wonder whether we should be reevaluating exactly that.
Well, we decided that we would try to look at the collection and sort out things that could be touched without too much risk. And perhaps easier with our collection. We've got a very strong stone tool collection. And eventually, both the curators and the conservators were persuaded that if we have 700,000 hand axes, some of those
2 or 3
2 or 3 might be allowed to be held by the public under supervision, of course. And it is, of course, extraordinary because you hold one of these things, which is anything up to 1.5 million years old, and the minute you've got it in your hand, you know it was made for your hand. Right. And you see immediately how you would use it to strip leaves off a tree or meat off a bone or whatever. And this, having reassured everybody on that front, then going to the other parts of the collection and looking at what could be handled and therefore taken out. We haven't been as ambitious yet as a van, but I would like to be. But I think the idea of deciding which bits of the collection can be touched without undue risk, it completely changes the way the visitor can engage with the object and both how it was made and how it was used.
Right. And we all know museums are a risk management. If you keep things in a dark box, they might be safer, but of course they're not used. If they're out in public and you can hold them, then they're going to be used up quickly. Yeah. And I think it's a constant balance. It's interesting, in our Oceanic Tribal galleries, I was very adamant that as many works not be under plexiglass as possible, in part because they're ritual objects that were meant to be held. We can't hold them anymore, but putting them behind glass and reflections takes you that much further. And this was a case where I worked with our curator Nancy Thomas, but also an artist, Franz West, Austrian artist, to create a new kind of playful environment, bases that were made of cheap lumber, things that were off kilter, a funny grass-like bench, and he painted the walls with green tea. All of it intended in a way to enhance the playfulness, to sort of send subliminal signals that these objects were in motion and meant to be used. And it's true now, they're tied down for earthquakes and other reasons. They can't move, we can't touch them, but this continual struggle to create an environment that has a feeling of activity, especially for objects like hand axes and other things that weren't meant for museums. These were meant for ritual use, for daily life.
Can I ask about this? I mean, I thought this gallery, the Oceania Gallery was marvelous, because we would never dare, I think, put objects like this out of a case. And I just wonder whether your public is perhaps better behaved than ours.
What do you think? LA? Yes.
Yeah, well, no. I was very, because it does animate them in a remarkable way.
It's a huge difference.
And while your security, your gallery warding staff, or whatever you call them, the guards, are fierce, they were reticently fierce, I thought. But I was very admiring what it does to the things.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing this as an experiment. It's worked out very well. We've had a very respectful public, but I think it's part of a whole series of, it's the same impulse. How do we create more animation, more accessibility? In this case, even having an artist do it, having a living hand present to organize it. Or very recently, we just included photographs, and I've been trying to push that idea of these 19th century photographs that give you the sense of living people, and bring those into contact with the object. So you have a Hawaiian drum there that was actually a Captain Cook object, and then you have these images of people, some Hawaiian and others. And I think we need to keep experimenting to try to find ways to not let the object sit deadly in a case, especially for objects that weren't meant for picture galleries. I mean, certain European paintings were intended for those environments, and then there are a lot of objects in our museums that aren't.
The photographs I thought were terrifically interesting for this because they did bring the things very near, and there's always a danger, I think, in presenting material like this, that it seems ineffably remote and mysterious and other. I mean, you see it terribly strongly in the Quai Branly in Paris Museum, where those of you who've been know, you walk up a long, slow, curling ramp, and it gets darker and darker and darker, and eventually you reach primitive world. It's an extraordinary, and what is wonderful about this is you realize, of course, it's not at all primitive world. These are people like us, so like us they can be photographed.
Well, that was the intention.
Things.
Actually,
Exactly.
this was a little bit of reaction to the Quai Branly. It's right at the entrance. It's white walls. It's a contemporary artist. It was the sense of trying to create an intimacy and immediacy that was more present. And I think we keep trying to do that. I also believe in experimentation, especially with things. I'm curious. I know you walked through the museum without me today, so I have no idea what your impressions were. But did you see the pre-Columbian galleries with the Jorge Pardo installation?
These I thought were completely wonderful. It took me some time to work out what was going on.
That's the experimentation part.
And I wondered if I waited long enough whether the curtains at the top would part.
Yes, for the performance.
And there would be an epiphany, or maybe you had to take something for that to happen. You did feel you were on the edge of narcotic excitement.
That was the idea of these sculptures.
Exactly, and the colours, certainly. I thought this was quite differently from the Oceanian gallery. It made me feel that, again, these objects were made by people sort of like us, but thinking differently. Right. And I looked at these in a way that I've never looked at this kind of material before.
I like the hallucinogenic references because a lot of these objects were meant for transformation rituals. And, again, we have to think these weren't made for museums to be displayed. That was not their function. And so there's this continuum. We don't want to lose them. We wouldn't not have them accessible, but we have to keep rethinking. I mean, this idea of contemporary art, I think, is just general. I was in Korea, and of course, it's funny, this is our gallery of Korean ceramics with a young Korean artist that we just acquired, and it was maybe not surprising. I was in Seoul last week, and I was in the Samsung Museum seeing the exact same installation, and they had picked the exact same artist. So there must be something going on in that sense. But I was curious, you walked through the rest of the galleries of LACMA. What were your impressions?
Well, walking around LACMA is really like walking around the world. And except that it's actually quite difficult to know which way you're walking. It's a sort of mystery tour of the world. And you head for Africa, and if you take a wrong turn, you're suddenly in German cinema of the 1920s. And it is, there's a very famous hymn that we all sing in schools in Britain, God moves in a mysterious way. But I say, God doesn't move nearly as mysterious a way as LACMA. The sheer bewilderment that you experience does, of course, keep you constantly on your toes because you can't prepare yourself for a response to something because you don't know what it's going to be. And I don't know whether this is deliberate, but it's certainly remarkable.
Can I put you in the camp that it wouldn't be a bad idea to build a new building and reorganize?
Well, you certainly can, because a number of things. I mean, it is of course exciting to discover the unexpected, but there's a problem, of course, that you don't. It's difficult to find things you want to find. You worry about having not seen what you wanted to see, and I found that very much in the European galleries, which have been, I think, magnificently re-put together, putting the sculpture and the paintings and whatever to allow different kinds of narratives. But those rooms are very difficult. I thought it was very interesting that you have this large exhibition of the Veroneses given to allegories of navigation, because my goodness, you need navigation in this place, allegorical or not. And those European galleries, again, I was constantly worried that I'd maybe missed Holland or something. And if I had missed it, where would it be? And I think a different, I mean, starting again must make, and you're lucky, we can't, unfortunately, because no matter how many beehives we promised on the new building, we'd never get the planning permission. But you actually can do it, I think, which would be an amazing thing.
Well, we can do it. We will do it. I think there's something interesting about, also we were talking about, because you were so admiring of the curatorial work in those galleries that I think Patrice is here, but of placing Roman sculptures with European paintings across time and space to show their references. And for many years, those classical sculptures were off on their own until our curator, Patrice, reintegrated them. And it's one of the things I'm curious about is that every age has its own scholarship and its own ideas of art history. And I always think of it as a positive to rearrange museums if you have the world, like I've seen art curators do. And I'm curious whether that's how do you see that future of objects? And are they fixed? Are they rearrangeable?
Well, I think what's so interesting is that for all of us that every generation has a different reading of history, or rather every generation wants to ask different questions of the objects and see different connections. And the ideal must be to be able to reconfigure the collection on a regular basis. And certainly, particularly once we started doing something like the history of the world in 100 objects and thinking about the connections, what that left us with was a very strong curatorial discontent with the fixed galleries we'd inherited. Our problem, I was terribly envious walking around today on lots of grounds, but one thing is that almost everything in this museum can be carried and moved. The real difficulty with Egyptian monumental sculpture or whatever is that you simply can't move Ramesses II 20 feet to the left to see whether it would work better. You have to rebuild the whole damn place. So we're trying to get to a two-tier thing of the very large monumental material will have to be rearranged in a long-term way, but the rest should have a much more flexible position. I really envy you the opportunity of being able to rethink this many times.
Right. I mean, I've seen art curators rethink things within years, and bring in objects from other departments. And so I think the future architecture will hopefully make that easier, because architecture, as you said, is one of the challenges to that. I know we don't have much time, but I did want you to say, you were going to talk a little bit about some of your engagement with contemporary art and artists, which I'm interested in. I don't think of the British Museum that way.
We have, and obviously we've always collected contemporary things, and in our particular geographical galleries, we have modern works. But we have a program of inviting contemporary artists. This is the potter, Grayson Perry, who's a very popular potter, very popular spokesman for the visual arts in the UK, who did an exhibition in the British Museum last year, the next one, of choosing works that the characteristic of all the works was they were made by somebody whom we didn't know, called the whole thing The Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman. And the idea was to choose fascinating objects from all periods, all places, and put them beside works that he had made or contemporary works. And he constructed this wonderful ship, which has replicas of lots of things from all over the BM in it, as the ship grave of the unknown craftsman. And his point was that we have, of course, fetishized the artist in Western Europe in the last couple of centuries, and that what one should really be thinking about is the compulsion of humanity to make beautiful things from the very beginning. From the earliest hand axes, we tried to make them beautiful as well as functional. And he put together, this is the old Egyptian god Bes, protector of children, and this is Grayson Perry's sculpture of his teddy bear, who has a particular role in his iconography, and which he talks about a great deal. And he himself is not a reticent artist, as you can see.
Humility,
exactly. He went on a very well-publicized tour filmed by the BBC on this bicycle, and at the back of the bicycle is a shrine within it, his own favorite teddy bear. This was we had the motorcycle outside the exhibition, and it allowed us to try a new kind of outreach to a new kind of public. As you know, the British are obsessed with teddy bears. So we ran a competition for teddy bears to sit in the shrine during the exhibition. The next one, please. And every teddy bear had to submit their resume. And there was then a judging panel. And these teddy bears turned out to have extraordinarily various and challenging lives. And it was a very striking way. It did bring in, I'm afraid, rather distressingly large number of mildly deranged people who have since become very faithful
Good,
visitors.
you've saved us from doing this now that you've already done it.
Reaching out can be risky. But the other area was I wanted to show because it ties exactly with what you're doing. And indeed, our two Islamic departments are working together. The contemporary Middle East is an area where we've been focusing very, very strongly indeed. The great danger of seeing the Middle East either in terms of distant antiquity or of religious fanaticism seems very important to address by showing contemporary art, and above all contemporary art by and about women. And the exhibition upstairs at the moment, I think, is simply wonderful. And my colleague Venetia Porter is coming in a few days to see it and to talk about it, I know. But this does seem to be an area where I know we're working together, but critical, where the contemporary must be part of our investigation of an Islamic tradition.
Yeah, it's interesting because that whole exhibition of contemporary art of the Middle East, Islamic art, is done by our curator, Linda Komaroff, who's previously was not involved in contemporary art, and she immediately saw the connections in talking to artists about content rather than thinking of objects in an order of time, that it's an exploration of subject matter and ideas and history, and less interested in the fact that I always want to say, just get rid of the word contemporary if you just have art and artists, and then you can sort of think about time and subject matter in a different way. It can be interesting. I know artists have also been very generous to the museum.
Jim Dine has just given us a very large gift. One of the cultures that we're about to present to a bewildered Britain is the modern United States. We've done Afghanistan, we've done China,
and now the most exotic.
Now the hardest to grasp. And
will LA be included?
How not? How not? Again, we very much depend on the contemporary artists, not just to engage and interview with the collection, but to give us work. And the prints and drawings section is the graphic collection, the National Graphic Collection, and absolutely up to date. And these gifts are very, very important. But I wanted to go back, if I may, to the next one, to what you were, if we can.
You mean this?
Yeah. Talking about the Middle East and the long continuities and why the contemporary and the past need to be thought about together and fit together. Because we're not a museum of art at the British Museum, we're a museum of societies and how societies work. And we need to chart the modern day. One of the things we wanted to chart was what was happening in Libya when Gaddafi fell. And particularly, one of the things we tried to plot in these moments, like the fall of communism in '89 in Eastern Europe, is what happens to images of rulers. And fascinatingly, what happened here, as you see, this is, of course, an image of Gaddafi on the banknote. The notes had to be kept because there was no other currency, but somehow Gaddafi had to be disabled. And what we discovered, to our fascination, was that the way this was done was by removing his nose. And that is really fascinating, because if you go back to that sculpture you saw at the beginning, this is exactly what ancient Egyptians did, to leave the statue standing, but remove its power and dishonor the person represented. And the continuity of that gesture over nearly over 4,000 years in that region is, I think, one of the most extraordinary things. And one of the things that only collections and museums like these ones can do. And I find it totally fascinating, totally bewildering. What is going on? At what level of consciousness do people operate when they go on carrying out that kind of gesture? And how important to know it if we're really trying to understand what it's like to be a Libyan or an Egyptian.
Right, it is to take the breath away, the ability to breathe and live.
Exactly.
It's very powerful. I wanted to end just with a recent event, which was that the famous Elgin marbles, which are always talked about, were recently, there was news that they were lent for the first time to St. Petersburg. And this was a big event, I think, and a very generous. I know that you have led the efforts, not only in your own museum, but in Great Britain, to be more generous in lending objects outside. And I know that's one of the cases because a lot of times, I mean, there's this debate about who owns objects and cultural patrimony, and there's this sense that an object is sort of owned like in possession, it's held, it's kept, but in fact, the whole world of the fraternity of museums exist to almost hold collections together. I mean, we do exchange work in vast numbers all the time at certain risk, but as a sort of fraternity of like one museum in a way.
Exactly. This was, for us and for our trustees especially, a very, very important decision. First of all, to go back to the founding of the museum and the Enlightenment idea, when Parliament creates the museum, it says that the objects are to be held by the trustees in that wonderful 18th century formulation for all studious and curious people, native and foreign. So from the beginning, this was to be for the whole world. What the trustees, what originally that meant, could only mean was you put it in the middle of London, opened it free, published it, whatever. Now, of course, you can publish it digitally, but one of the other great changes of the last 30 years is the technology of transportation. Things can travel. And the sharing of this, showing of this to the whole world is now, our trustees believe, one of the key responsibilities. The Hermitage this year is, in 2014, was 250 years old. And they decided they wanted to mark that by asking for one supreme gift from the British Museum. I mean, the slightly older sister. And it was decided that the perfect gift of one Enlightenment museum to another was a sculpture of the culture that in the 18th century personified rational debate, a society based on the ability to disagree and then to work together. And so the decision was taken to lend the river god, the Ilissos, which is the river outside Athens where Socrates used to walk and to debate. And the idea of marking that solidarity, that all the great museums in the world are really one venture working together, was put to the test by the fact that we agreed this quite a long time ago. And then when it came to the loan, we were in the middle of the crisis about Ukraine. And the trustees had to take a decision. They're not, of course, part of government. That was the great 18th century separation. But was it responsible, was it proper to lend an object like this to Russia at a moment when everybody deplored what the Russians were doing in Ukraine? Would it look as though this was in some way condoning that action? Would it encourage whatever? The trustees, working with Dr. Petrovsky, the great hero director of the Hermitage, decided that this was the moment above all to show that whatever happens politically, museums must go on working together. And that this idea of a republic of letters, a community of inquiry that is worldwide, that must persist and work together, whatever's going on politically, that had to be reinforced. And so the sculpture went to St. Petersburg. It was received, it has to be said, really with rapture by the local public. who, of course, had never seen an ancient Greek sculpture, ever. All the antique sculptures in the Hermitage are Roman copies. And so what happened in Petersburg was exactly what happened when the Parthenon sculptures arrived in London, where until then Western Europe knew only Roman copies. And the arrival of the first real Greek sculpture caused a sensation. And the idea of this exchange, this trust between institutions, in spite of the politics, was, I think, a very important gesture to make. And it is, I think, for all of us, now one of the great challenges. We're lucky enough, for historic reasons, in Western Europe and in the United States, to hold these global collections. The real challenge now, I think, is how we share them, how we let them be seen elsewhere, different combinations, different permutations, so that different narratives can be told elsewhere. What I found fascinating for the Russians is, of course, they see themselves as very closely deriving from a Greek inheritance, not just from the Black Sea, the Orthodox Church, but in all kinds of other ways. They felt that this was their inheritance, which they, for the first time, were being allowed to see. And I think to make this on a global scale is really the challenge.
And I think we will do that more and more. And I have to say, I know we've gone way over our time, but not just for tonight, but for all you've done in your bravery, in this case, leadership and creativity, I think we all owe you a great debt in leading our field and thinking about these issues. So thank you very much, Neil, for being here.
Thank you, Michael.
We really, really,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.